This video is sponsored by Nebula, the thoughtful streaming service created by me and my creator friends. Check out the link in the description or stay tuned to learn more.
When people think about Paris Transit, I think they often think about the Metro and RER, two systems I've covered in depth on this channel. The Metro is a frequent local rapid transit system for the city of Paris, while the RER is an express rapid transit system covering the center and the suburbs. But on top of these two well-known networks is the comparatively underappreciated and young Paris tram system, which despite only being opened in the 90s and only seeing major growth in the 2000s, moves the better part of 1 million people every day, with over 10 lines on what has become one of the world's preeminent tram systems. So let's jump in, look at the lines, and see what makes this system tick. It's all too often been forgotten, but Paris, like Los Angeles, London, and all kinds of cities around the world, used to be absolutely covered in trams, until its system fell into decline with worsening service, ubiquitous metro, and the death blow that was struck by the automobile. And while the city did manage to go decades without its trams, in these intervening years it was clear that there was still a need for a high-capacity local transit mode in the burbs that cost far less than new metro construction, which was slowing down, but which would enable a level of service superior to that of a bus, which in urban Paris in particular are small and slow. Paris's new network emerged in the 1990s, and with it came an entirely new way of building trams that had been developing across France. While cities like Amsterdam, Berlin, and Toronto kept their legacy trams, these systems far too often had critical flaws. Vehicles which traditionally had high floors were inaccessible, trams got caught in traffic and were less numerous than other road vehicles, creating lots of problems, and even where dedicated lanes were provided, intersections created a serious bottleneck for speed and frequency. In Paris, new lines would be designed in a fundamentally different way from trams of old. Vehicles wouldn't run on the street in mixed traffic and would virtually always get their own dedicated space, treated not like extra transit lanes but as a true street railway that need not abide by the laws of buses. These new routes would be laid down on completely reconstructed streets, with green track reducing noise and runoff as well as the urban heat island effect. There would also be tons of pedestrian space with lots of crosswalks, even between stops where people crossing weren't necessarily even using the trams. And those stops would be nice and modern, providing all kinds of amenities not usually found at bus stops, like real-time arrivals, ticketing, and level boarding for accessibility. Stops were spaced widely, unlike the trams of old, with distances between averaging half a kilometer, longer than even the legacy metro in Paris, letting the trams fly along at surprising speed through the beautiful new urban environment. While many of Paris's tram lines have been extended over the years, in this video I'll only talk about their initial opening dates and current states. The first modern tram line to open in Paris in the 90s was the T1 route, which like all following tram routes would use standard gauge tracks and 750-volt DC overhead lines. T1 is an east-west orbital line north of the city, running 17 kilometers with 37 stops that provides connections to Metro Lines 5 and 7, as well as both branches of Line 13 and the RER C, D, and E. It's probably worth pointing out here that most of the modern Paris tram system is not in Paris proper, but in its various suburbs. And even the sections which do enter the city proper, which is saturated with Metro and RER service, stay more or less towards the edges. Under the Parisian model, tramways make the most sense not in distant suburbs where demand can be met by buses, or in the core of the city where the capacity of a metro is needed, but in the middle where density can fill the vehicles up and lots of connections can be made to other rail services. And those connections tend to look different from in other tram systems. While in Toronto, streetcars go underground or into off-street loops to connect to the subway, and in other systems, interchanging metro stations have stairs straight up to the tram platforms, something that, to be clear, does exist in Paris, say where T1 meets Line 13. However, in Paris, most of the interchanges can happen on wide sidewalks or in public plazas on redesigned streets, providing a high-quality transfer but without a super high price tag. All of these connections can create a ton of ridership, and T1, which has both the most stops and the longest route on the Paris tram system, moves almost 200,000 people a day, a feat made only more astonishing by its use of the smallest trams on the system, which are 70% low-floor TFS models, literally the standard French tramway vehicle that was used in a number of modern New Age French tram systems. Fortunately, T1 is getting overhauled right now to boost its capacity, with new 5-segment trams from Alstom that remind me a bit of trams from Skoda with free turning front bogies.
And this is coming along with extensions east to the RER A and E and Metro Line 11, as well as west to T2 where the system will actually interline.
Speaking of that, the next line to open was the T2, another orbital route, this one north-south, with 24 stops on an 18-kilometer line, giving it the widest stop spacing in the system. T2 starts as a north-south tram line in the west of the city, before diving underground at the contemporary Ile-de-France business district, which is a real underappreciated transit megahub. From here, the line runs along a surface rail corridor, the Seine, and the RERC, and then turns back into a conventional tram for the last leg of its journey. T2, just like T1, has been a smash success, attracting over 100,000 riders every day. And to handle this, the line operates dual 5-segment trams coupled together, an oddity in the system, and the trams themselves have an oddity in their coupler covers, instituted to improve safety in the event of a collision. This wasn't a consideration originally because the line wasn't meant to be extended with street-running sections. Line T2 connects Line 1 and the RER A and E at Ile-de-France, as well as to the Transilienne LNU and the RERC further to the south, as well as to our next line, arguably the centerpiece of the Paris tram network at its southern end. Hot on the heels of the first two lines, Paris opened a flurry of projects in the 2000s, none more notable than T3. T3 is a tram route that almost completely encircles Paris, near its edge along wide boulevards just inside the Périphérique Ring Road. And the line, which has 58 stops on 30 kilometers of track, astonishingly moves over 300,000 people every day, more than many entire tram systems and even some subway systems. To handle the demand, the line has some of Paris's biggest trams, with 7 segments and double the length of an articulated bus at nearly 50 meters long, as well as the full standard modern tram width of 2.65 meters as opposed to the 2.3 meter wide tram seen before. All along the route of T3, you can see some of the most dramatic street redesigns in the system, and substantial urban regeneration and development spurred on by the new transit. T3 was also the first line to institute modern green track, something that took inspiration from Strasbourg. The line makes loads of connections along the way, including a direct one down to the metro at Porte de Choisy. In the east and north, things get interesting, with a number of two-track diversions off of the main boulevard. In one case, to cross a canal on a dedicated tram and pedestrian bridge, and again to pass under an apartment building into a wide pedestrian plaza to provide comfortable connections to the RER at Rosa Parks, which also features one of the few grade separations you'll see on the network, taking trams under a busy road. These alignments where the trams divert off the main corridor they are serving and even cut through the middle of blocks show a lot of creativity, and they help provide better connections and urban spaces, and can be seen across the network. They also once again help to make the tram a superior alternative to the car, by literally going where cars can't, and by not being limited to existing road corridors like so many of the world's tram systems, old and new. Although in this case, low overpasses did sort of force some of these decisions, Paris planners clearly did not suffer much from corridor fixation, as the response to "this overpass is too low" was not to simply raise it. Now, the newest leg of T3 opened in 2024, and meets the RERE extension, while also ending near Paris's Western Urban Park, and serving a rather interesting stop on the way that is a very narrow island platform with separate platform faces for trams in both directions. If you're familiar with Paris's tram system, you've probably been yelling at your screen that T3 is actually split into 2 routes, meeting at Porte de Vincennes, with connecting tracks and 2 separate 2-track termini on either side of the boulevard with connections to the metro. T3A runs to the south and west, and T3B runs to the east and north. The split was deemed necessary as the line grew longer and longer as a measure to maintain reliability, and it's mostly fine, because outside of transit fans, it probably never makes sense to ride around the whole circle, since it will usually take at least twice as long as cutting across on the metro. Along its circling route, T3 manages to make a ton of connections, including to T2, Line 7 several times, Line 8 and Line 13 3 times, Line 4, 14, 1, 3, and 12 twice, Line 9, 11, 5, and 2, the 3 bis and 7 bis, and every RER line except for Line D. And all of these connections fuel the massive ridership. A number of new lines opened in the 2010s, although their relative youth and probably their radial routes means that they mostly move tens of thousands a day as opposed to the hundreds of thousands of riders seen on earlier lines, often acting more as metro extenders than as interconnectors. 2 of these lines, lines T5 and T6, use the Trams-Lore rubber tire tram technology that functions much like a tram but is kind of more like a bus, and that I talked about in a previous video. T5 is both the shortest line on the system and has the least stops and the tightest stop spacings, with 16 stops over just 6.5 kilometers of rail. The line runs north from T1 on a tight alignment where the trams run alongside just one car lane on a narrow street before hopping into the median of a boulevard and heading dead straight to the north before diverting to pass through a dense tract of post-war housing to terminate along the RERD. If you look at wayfinding materials, you'll see that T5 has connections to Metro Line 13 in 2 places, but these are walking connections and fairly long half-kilometer ones at that. And unfortunately, because of the way Translore works, it also can't cross the T1 line to continue further south. In many ways, I find T5 to be the least pleasant of Paris's trams. The rubber tires mean no green track, and the vehicles are tiny 3-segment ones with a very bumpy ride. And even worse, buses can't use the Translore's narrow right-of-way. T6 is Paris's other radial Translore line, running south and west in the south of the city, and it's quite a bit bigger than its sibling, with 6-segment vehicles and a 14-kilometer 21-stop route. Though fortunately, proactive protective measures have been taken so that the line, which is more substantial than T5, can eventually be converted to use real trams. This line is also a lot more interesting because it starts at the south end of Line 13, tucked away under a building, before running out into the suburbs and new towns to the southwest, and climbing along a nice but rather steep boulevard, including a number of landscape sections that try and fail to be as nice as regular old green track, all filling in the gaps where a southern extension of Metro Line 13 was once planned. After turning off the main boulevard the line runs on, T6 actually has the only section of mixed traffic running on Paris's urban trams besides on T1, and from here it winds its way through the suburban environment, passing huge apartment blocks and a major shopping mall. At the far western end of its route, the line turns back north and then enters a huge hilly forested area and dives into a tunnel, the only such segment on the Paris tram system, which carries the line to Viroflay, where it meets both the RERC and the Transilien L, and which unfortunately is not actually very heavily used. While I'm not super hot on T6, I do appreciate the plaza stop at Centre de Châtillon, which reminds me of the one on T3 at Porte de Versailles Parc des Expositions, where the tram platform naturally blends into a large public plaza. With Tram T7, Paris's trams return to steel wheels, albeit with somewhat smaller 5-segment units that actually also return to the previous 2.3 meter wide size. This route effectively acts like an extension of Line 7 of the Metro to Paris-Orly Airport, and much of it, as you'd probably expect, is the usual median-running green track affair. This green track is upgraded, however, and instead of being a perfect lawn monoculture, it's made up of sedums and little shrubs and flowers that are hardier and better suited to the green track job. This allows for much less costly and intensive maintenance compared to the lawns seen on T3. About halfway south to Orly, T7 makes a big swing to the west to make several stops around the massive Rungus Marché International food market and its associated logistics facilities, which measure over 2 kilometers wide and 1 kilometer long, and replace Les Halles, now Paris's biggest transit interchange, as the region's primary food market.
From here, T7 crosses Line 14, leaps over highways, winds through airport-adjacent business parks, and crosses empty fields, connecting with the RERC,
before arriving at Orly Airport with a stop near Terminal 4. It then passes under the eastern east-west runway on a right-of-way that also can be used by buses, and terminates near a shopping center and a concourse. There's something really cool about a tram with green track and all rolling into an airport that I really like. The contrast of small vehicles with the huge terminal and of the green track with the massive seas of concrete and asphalt create this great contrast. I also have to shout out the maintenance yard for T7, which like many in Paris has a neat design and housing right on top of the tram storage area. T7, which currently runs just over 11 kilometers with 18 stops, is actually set to be extended further south in the future to Juvisy, including using another underpark tram tunnel like the one on the T6. T8 feels like a sibling to T7. It was built around the same time, uses the same 5-segment vehicles, and is also radial, running 8.5 kilometers with 17 stops and branches. The route starts along the eastern branch of Metro Line 13, just north of the Ile-de-France, and runs to the north along a canal, crossing T1 at grade, albeit only with one connecting track, the only case of such a crossing in the system. To the north of here, you really get a chance to see the careful alignment design of the Paris tram system in action, where the line goes from the side of a street to the median to a dedicated cross-block tram route to the other side of a street and back to the median in less than a kilometer, optimizing tram movements all along.
Just north of here, the line splits in two, with the eastern branch running up to a university and tram train station,
as well as to a maintenance depot via a very interesting single green track through a park, while the western branch runs over to the RERC and the center of Epinay. In the not-so-distant future, T8 will be extended further south to meet T3 and the RERE. There have already been a few tram lines that have opened in the Paris region in the 2020s, which like the T7 and T8 are like siblings, using these same vehicles, this time beautifully illuminated 7-segment Citadis XO5 units, in line with those on T3 but much more attractive, with similar stops and alignment designs. Tram T9 is a radial route just east of T7, starting on the eastern branch of Metro Line 7 and connected to T3A, and heading out to Orly city centre, a total of 19 stops over 10.5 kilometers of track. While T9 is beautiful in its trams and modern stop design, the actual route is pretty boring, mostly being a straight shot median tram that only turns at the far southern end of its route where a walking connection to the RERC can also be made. And that brings us to Paris's last urban tram line, the T10, which opened in summer 2023 and runs 8 kilometers with 13 stops. T10 is an orbital route, the first such urban one to be built since T3, and starts on the RERB in the south of Paris, running west past various dense suburban housing tracts and business parks to pass under T6 and connect it with a major hospital, before terminating at the edge of the large forest that T6 runs in its tunnel underneath, all extending the TVM, Europe's busiest bus route, to the west. If you've been paying attention, that gives us a total of 9 different urban tram routes, or 10 if you consider T3 as 2, with T2, T3, and T9, T1, T5, and T8, as well as T10 and T6 connecting with one another, and with T7 being the only tram route in Paris not to connect with another. However, with the extensions mentioned earlier of T1 to T2 and T8 to T3, the network will get a lot more connected. Meanwhile, T1, T2, T3, and T10 are orbital routes, with the rest of the lines operating as radial ones. So what can we learn from Paris's tramways, besides how to create a beautiful tram and streetscape? Well, Paris rarely has used the tram as a crucial artery for its transit system. Instead, these lines are designed to augment and connect the metro, RER, and suburban trains, with suburbs traditionally lacking in high-quality transit connections, as well as universities and other major urban developments, creating secondary routes that can move huge numbers of people, but which could be built quickly and at low cost.
Now, you're probably aware that something is missing, because I didn't mention a T4, and you might have also heard that Paris has an entire network of express tram trains, and to learn more about those, you can watch my video on the latest one, T12, here on YouTube, and a video dedicated to the rest of them, T4, T11, and T13, exclusively on Nebula right now. Nebula is the streaming platform owned by me and my creator friends, featuring over 14,000 titles that you can watch ad-free, including exclusive and early access videos from urbanist creators like myself, City Nerd, City Beautiful, Life Where I'm From, and Not Just Bikes. We also now have a news division and a film studio, where some of the very best content creators are making excellent large-scale projects you won't be able to find anywhere else, such as The Getaway, a really exciting Nebula original series from the creators of Jetlag the Game, where 6 different content creators go on a road trip full of exciting games and competitions. Watching my channel on Nebula is one of the best ways you can support my channel and my content as a whole, and as of now, lifetime memberships are back indefinitely for only $300, so you can pay once and get Nebula for as long as both you and Nebula exists, and so Nebula can fund bigger projects in the near future. And if lifetime memberships are not your cup of tea, you can still support me for only $36 a year or $3 a month with our annual plans. We're also now offering annual gift cards so you can share my Nebula exclusive videos with your friends and family too. So go check out Nebula at go.nebula.tv/rmtransit right now.